Welcome to the Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Feds. I am Stephanie Weidle. Before beginning this interview, I encourage you all to follow us on social media and visit our website where you can learn more about our organization and sign up for our newsletters. There you can also donate towards our mission and our listener-supported podcast, all at fedsforfreedom.org. Our next conference, co-sponsored by Virginia Medical Freedom Alliance, is coming up on October 10th and 11th at Patrick Henry College in Northern Virginia. We have a great lineup of speakers. Do be keeping your eye out for more information. What's the latest regarding the military COVID reinstatement process? What different approaches can service members take to force accountability? Well, this week, I am joined by Kacy Dixon, a former U.S. Air Force major who served for 15 years as both an intelligence officer and JAG before leaving the military over the COVID mandates. Kacy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I appreciate it.
So, okay, Kacy, for those who may not know you, could you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. I started out military service in 2009 as an intelligence officer. And about 8 years in, I started going to law school. I actually left active duty and went to the Guard temporarily and attended law school at that time. Came back on active duty as a JAG, and I was serving as an active duty attorney during the COVID mandates when all of that kicked off.
And so what happened to you in the military with the mandates?
So I was actually, I say this all the time, like, I've gotten dozens, maybe hundreds of shots, who knows, without ever even thinking about it, without a second thought. And I credit this to God. It was very much a God intervention. But I had struggled getting pregnant with my son for about 2.5 years. And I was finally pregnant during the mandate, and actually just leading up to it. So when all the COVID stuff kicked off and, we kind of knew that the mandates were on the horizon, I had actually proactively gone to my doctor and asked what I should do as to the vaccine. I said, I'm carrying a high-risk pregnancy. I want to make sure I'm doing everything that I can to keep my baby safe. And that particular doctor told me that the clinical trials did not include pregnant women. And so there was no data on the vaccine as to pregnant women, and that it was just going to have to be an individual choice on what I did. And, I had the original strain of COVID like very early on, and thankfully for me, it was very mild. So I made the pragmatic decision, like, this is a known, the vaccine is an unknown. I'm not going to get it. And that was kind of it. But about 2 months later, I PCS'd. I did a military move, and my new doctor was adamant that I get the shot. And it was such a stark contrast from what this other doctor had told me. And so there was kind of a line of inquiry there, and it wasn't very compelling what the doctor was telling me. So for the first time in my life, I went and looked at a vaccine on my own. Like, let me look at the packet insert. Let me see what I can figure out. And I'm not a medical person. So really from that perspective, all that it said was, this has not been tested in pregnant and nursing women, so ask your doctor. But what did become very clear from some of the literature I was reading was that there was a legal issue, which is right up my alley. And that was when I realized the distinction between emergency use authorized products, which were still experimental, and fully FDA approved products. And so I knew that there was a significant legal issue with the mandate of these products, which I raised through my chain of command. I even brought it up to the TJAG of the Air Force, which is the 3-star attorney in charge of the entire Air Force. And basically, when there was no resolution on any of that, I joined litigation in the court case Coker v. Austin and started suing the Department of Defense.
And so what led to your resignation from the military?
So this is also very much a God thing. And I have seen his hand in this from before I even knew the word COVID. And it's really a longer story than probably can share on here, but he has a plan for all of us. And his plan has been very evident for me throughout. And I see it continuing to play out to this day. But in short, we fought the fight. We were in court. The mandate was rescinded. And, I kind of came out on the other side thinking, okay, we're safe now. Like, I can continue on with my career. I can get to 20 years of service like I always intended. And, God put on my heart very clearly, you're done, which I've had a very blessed life. And this is actually the first time where what I felt God was calling me to do was not in line with my own desires. So, it was, I thought after kind of the fight that we were fighting, like, okay, we made it. I'll be one of the people that's able to stay in and help right the ship in the aftermath. But yeah, God placed a calling on my heart that it was time to leave military service. And, it's been actually kind of amazing because once I did that, I've had so many more opportunities in this fight that I would not have been able to accept or carry out had I still been active duty. So,
Well, that's amazing.
it
So
is
what are
amazing.
you up to now?
So, my husband just retired from the military after 25 years. So I got out in October of 24, and we actually just moved into our house. He retired last month, and we're in the process of moving. I'm sitting in basically an empty house right now. But in that meantime, I elected not to, job hunt or do anything like that. I kind of focused exclusively on fighting this fight. I knew we were moving soon anyway, so I didn't want to settle into a job for 6 months just to move again. And it's been really, a lot of fruit has come from this period of time. I had the opportunity to go to the Pentagon to discuss COVID reinstatement policy. One of the things that I heavily advocated for at that meeting was you have to admit it was unlawful. And, I explained the principle behind that. I explained the law behind that. And, I also incentivized it to them and said, here are all the reasons it's important to us. Because one, it's the right thing to do. Legally, this was done unlawfully. But I also pointed out that there's still ongoing litigation that Secretary Hegseth is now the named defendant in, because the litigation was against Secretary Austin. As the new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth is substituted in as the new defendant. And so I kind of laid out some of those cases that are ongoing and just said, Pete Hegseth has two options. He can continue making the same arguments as Lloyd Austin in his own name now and likely take the loss in court on those cases in his name, or he can tell the truth. And it's about that simple. So they were very receptive to that. And, a couple weeks later, there was a memo that said that the mandate was unlawful as implemented. So, which was huge for our movement.
Not only that, he looked in the camera and said, "We all know that this is unlawful."
Yes.
What an incredible acknowledgement, and
Yes.
one that all of the secretaries need to take note of and follow in his footsteps.
Yep. I very much think that Secretary Hegseth gets it. I really do. But, as we were kind of discussing before we started filming, there's just so much that the department is trying to work through right now. So I have a lot of grace. I have a lot of patience, but it's hard. You have a movement of tens of thousands of people who have been suffering and fighting for almost 5 years. And so it's hard to have that perspective of like, well, they're only 6 months into this fight, so a lot of people are understandably impatient. So, yeah, but there's been a lot of amazing opportunities to advocate within this movement. Mark Rashaw is another example. And again, I give all the credit to God. Like he provided an opportunity for me to make a connection actually via the X platform, where I advocated for Mark Bashaw to be pardoned for not testing and not masking. And we were able to get Mark Bashaw pardoned. And
that's incredible. When that popped up, I was like, I wonder what the backstory is to all of this. And
yep.
it is incredible.
Yep. We just, I made this connection, and I kind of laid out Mark's case, and I said, if President Trump and the administration are serious about this COVID restoration fight, here's the case. Here's a case where they can make a big difference. And I laid it out. I reached out to Mark and asked, and he was very diligent in documenting every single thing that happened to him, that he did. His level of substantiation of all of this is amazing. So I sifted through all of that and kind of made a concise package that I submitted, and this individual was able to go directly to President Trump and get Mark pardoned.
You've been at the forefront of the behind the scenes effort this entire time, at the acknowledgement that the mandate was unlawful, towards reinstatement of military members kicked out over the mandates, and towards true accountability. And that's why I wanted to talk with you. A couple weeks ago, the DoD proudly acknowledged that over a dozen members were reinstated after being kicked out. What do you know of those members?
So it's kind of interesting. We know, and I say we because all of this is such a collective effort. Like the meeting at the Pentagon, I have to give credit to Jordan Carr for her diligence in making connections that got us there. Davis Younce, who's also a retired military attorney, he came with us and, was instrumental in getting some good language to the boards of corrections for military records, so that people who are going through this process at least have a fighting chance. But the individuals who have gone through the BCMR process and received offers for reinstatement, we know of at least one who has said, we went through the process, we got an offer for reinstatement, but there's no mechanism to accept the offer. So it basically says, respond in X amount of time to accept reinstatement, but there's no mechanism of who to contact to accept it, of what the process looks like after that. So, and again, I try to have grace because I know that the administration is kind of building this airplane as they're flying it. They're trying to get this done, but there's some things that are being missed, that there's a lot actually that still needs correction. So I don't know. That's one of the 13. I can't speak to the other 12, but I'm not aware of anyone who has actually been brought back into service, even if their BCMR package has been processed and they've been offered that opportunity. So
I confess I did chuckle when I saw that statement. 13 is kind of low
yes,
for how many were kicked out. I saw that it would take how many years to hundreds of years to reinstate everybody at this rate. So something needs to change, and that's what I wanted to have you on to talk about, what needs to be changed. So currently,
so the 13 out of tens of thousands kind of reminded me of, when Pfizer was ordered to release all of their documents, and they're like, well, we can process them at this rate. And it's like, okay, so we'll have everything in like 75 years. That's not helpful. So, yeah.
Yes. So let's talk about the current reinstatement process. What are the hangups that people are finding? We've had several service members on this show, one being Mike Geary up in Maine, talking about the speed bumps that he was running into as he's trying to get reinstated again. Anyway, what have you found?
So some of the issues and these were things that even before they happened in the BCMR, we identified that they would be issues through the process. So the policy that initially came out was exclusive to COVID vaccine refusal. And that language was very specifically written. Well, the problem with that is we had people like Mark Bashaw who refused EUA testing, EUA masking. And so a lot of them hit speed bumps as to that stuff, where it was like, well, refusal of the COVID vaccination was only part of your quote unquote misconduct. And so, people who were directed, well, because you aren't vaccinated, you have to wear a mask and no one else does. Because you're not vaccinated, you have to take these experimental tests, no one else does. So refusal of those things, which again, everyone had the absolute right to informed consent to accept or decline those products as well. Things like that are hanging up some people in the BCMR process. We also see other people who have other minor disciplinary infractions where, and as a JAG, I know that this plays out this way, where once you are kind of on the radar, you get, I don't want to say targeted, but I mean, once you're on the radar, minor things that other people, might not get in trouble for, or, simply just told to correct it. Now you're highlighted. And so you might get negative paperwork when, if you weren't already on the radar, you might not have. So those are some of the issues that we see in the BCMR process. And there were also people who, another example, someone who didn't promote because of the ongoing negative paperwork with COVID and that kind of stuff. Well, now all the negative COVID stuff comes out of their record, but they're still being processed for separation because of failure to promote. And so that's all their record shows now. So then the BCMR looks at it and says, well, you're not, the ill effects that have happened to you aren't because of COVID, it's because you didn't promote. It's like, yeah, okay, but you have to walk that back and look at, the initiating thing.
And let me just clarify. So the BCMR is the place in which all of the reinstatement is being handled.
Yes. And it's a passive system. It is not a proactive system. All the burden is on the service member to, one, figure out what evidence would matter, how to coherently put a package together, how to submit it and navigate the system. And it's overwhelming and it's time consuming. And then I'll also say, some of the people that are key in our movement, people are having to go back through MEPS. People are having to, when you come into the military initially, there's so much paperwork. You have to fill out like every address of every place you've ever lived and all of your medical history and on and on and on. And it's just exhausting. It's burdensome. And so the process is just, it's another form of punishment at this point, even though it's not intended to be so. It is a burdensome process for people who are already fatigued from this fight to go through. And there's a way that we can more proactively identify these people and address some of this.
And what is that way?
So as I kind of mentioned, I think that there needs to be a small temporary task force that's established to address these specific cases. The BCMR handles all kinds of cases. So the COVID stuff is just one more pile of things that go into this pipeline. There's no prioritization for these cases. Some of these cases can take 12 to 18 months to resolve in that process. So I think that there needs to be a task force of people who understand the nuances of all these cases, who understand the issues, that can proactively review these cases and brainstorm and offer a proper remedy.
What other kinds of cases does the BCMR usually look at when it's not even COVID?
I mean, you name it, they probably look at it. Things like upgrading records. If you were, let's say you were discharged for any reason and you think that your service characterization should be better than what it was. So this is anyone who's been separated for any reason, whether it's, criminal misconduct, any kind of disciplinary infractions, those kind of things. Any kind of if you think your awards or decorations should be upgraded, it handles a breadth of things. And like I said, COVID is just one pile. The issue is twofold. One, it's a problem for the COVID refusers who are trying to go through this, but also it jams that system up
Yes.
for all of its standard processing as well.
Yeah. So it makes total sense to have a sub task force to handle. I mean, we're talking just under 9,000 people, correct?
Well, for those who were involuntarily discharged, which is to say they went through the formal discharge process and, were kicked out. That's about 8,700. And then, as you know, there are people who voluntarily separated, but
Yes.
under coercion. And that makes up probably tens of thousands more.
Yes. Okay. So that's another category I want to talk about. What is being done to make those people whole again? Not that any of this will make people whole again, but it's an attempt. So what is being done for those?
So they can apply to the BCMR as well. Jordan Carr, who again has been on the forefront of this, as an example, she applied to the BCMR. She's been very public about that and kind of given some updates on her X platform about what that's looked like. But she was categorized technically as a voluntary separation, but she was essentially, she was very much coerced into doing that. And
Yes.
at one point, she even tried to pull back her separation package and said, I don't want this to go through. And that didn't happen. It was forced through anyway. So she's going through the BCMR. It's kind of the same avenue for anyone to try and seek relief. And that's another thing is who knows how these cases will play out when the BCMR reviews them, potentially without, the entire context and say, well, you voluntarily separated. So that was your decision. We're not going to offer you relief. It's very possible that something like that could happen. So,
from a JAG perspective, what should be the outcome? What can be, we'll put everybody in a good spot. I mean, including the military. What can be done?
So let me give you an example of precedent of something similar. So under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was, I think, 2010, 2011, when that was repealed. Before that, a lot of service members were removed from military service for being gay. Under the Biden administration, they set up a task force that was a proactive task force that went through and looked at old records to see, do any of these people warrant an upgrade in their service characterization? And so that was something that was established proactively that was carried out. So, there is precedent to do this. There's no reason that we can't establish a group of people that can proactively seek out and go through these records without people soliciting it and just offer automatic upgrades if it's warranted.
Yes.
So that's one thing. And another thing that, we have also identified as an issue is because of the length of time that has passed, there are people who are no longer in a position or lack the desire to return to service. There's also precedent for this, offering retroactive separation pay. Right now we see policies where transgender service members who under the new administration are no longer eligible for service are being offered voluntary separation pay. So it's like a severance package. Submit a voluntary separation, you'll get this voluntary separation pay and we'll part ways, versus the Department of Defense having to expend resources and time to go through a forced separation process. I think that this should be offered as well to COVID refusers who are now no longer able or don't desire to return to service. We will give you retroactive separation pay. And this is actually something that I've lobbied a little bit for Congress to pick up, is to add appropriations to fund this specific thing. To essentially say, this should have never happened. You're welcome to come back, but if you cannot or do not want to, you can apply for separation pay.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and what would
there are a lot of things that can be done that, just aren't even being considered right now.
What would you say to people who say, well, there are not enough funds to cover all of this?
I would say I have spent 15 and a half years of my life in the military. And when you see firsthand the fraud, waste, and abuse, it's an abysmal argument to make. I mean, you have just upended and destroyed people's lives and livelihoods over, basically violating their rights. And, you can't figure out how to allocate however many millions to make it right in part. Like, there's no way that they'll ever be able to make this right in whole. But it would be a very poor argument to argue the monetary issue when to anyone who's been in the service and has seen the fraud, waste, and abuse and things money is spent on. It's a joke.
I do know that one thing discussed at the Pentagon when you were there with Jordan, with Davis, and speaking with the staff was the flu shot decliners.
Yes.
Many are being kicked out of the military over their declination of the flu shot. It seems that the military is going for 100% compliance. What do you know of recent developments there? I know that after coming on the show, Skip's pay was turned back on very, very unexpectedly. He let us know about that. But many are feeling a even deeper sense of betrayal from their own over this.
Yep.
So what do you know and what do you think will come of this?
So I'm not sure what will come of it. I can give you a little bit of insight into how the conversation went when we were at the Pentagon, as well as a little bit of insight into what the process should look like. And I think in some ways it's just a matter of getting this information and perspective to the very top. When things are passed through the chain of command, there's a filtering that happens, and it's, some information doesn't even make it to the top. Some that does is watered down. But one of the things that we discussed in that meeting was the flu shot. And basically the entire religious accommodation process is broken. Now, COVID was kind of unprecedented in how many were submitted. And so you would have, and here's actually the process, the problem and the concern moving forward, right? So pre-COVID, most JAGs probably never even saw a religious accommodation request for a vaccine. They were certainly happening, but not to the extent that they are now. And so, many JAGs just never had experience with that. Well, now, because of the mass amounts that were submitted during COVID, a lot of JAGs have had the opportunity to work on these, but it was under this process that the courts have called a sham, that the courts have called theater, that, had a predetermined outcome, which violates not only the Constitution, but also federal statute in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So what we have is now a whole cohort of JAGs who now have experience with the religious accommodation request process, but their only experience and understanding of it is these are typically blanket denials. And so we have to undo that. We have to undo that thought process because we have a whole slew of JAGs who are now trained improperly on how to process these requests. And unless we correct it, this is now the precedent moving forward, which is what we're seeing with the flu shot requests. So let me give you an example. And this was something that I outlined at the meeting. The question was raised like, well, what can be done? Like, what needs to happen? What policies need to change to address this? And I said, it's very simple. Follow the law. People just need to follow the law. RFRA accounts for all of this. And I said, here's what the legal process is. And it's an issue of burden shifting. So the initial burden is on the person requesting an accommodation to prove that they have a sincerely held belief that would warrant them receiving an accommodation. And once they prove that, once it's substantiated, it is almost a guaranteed approval under the law. Once that is shown, the default should be that they receive that accommodation. The burden shifts to the government then, if they're going to deny it, to prove under strict scrutiny, which is a very high level, to prove under strict scrutiny that the government has a compelling interest in denying that request. And that interest has to be as to that specific person. It can't be a theoretical or, broad interest that the government has. So when we saw the government saying, well, it's health of the force, we're denying this because of health of the force, that's not a sufficient reason. You have to show as to that specific individual why them not getting that shot would place an undue burden on the government. So that didn't happen. It's still not happening with the flu shot. They're getting very generic reasons. And one of the things that came up at that meeting was, when I brought this up, one of the senior individuals said, well, and understandably so, said, well, what happens when now we have, let's say, hundreds of thousands of people requesting exemption from the flu shot? And I said, so what? And then there was kind of silence because, it came off like a little bit, I wasn't being aggressive. I wasn't, trying to be confrontational, but I just said, so what? And we sat there and, I just let it sit for a minute. And I said, I don't say that flippantly. I say that to ask you genuinely, what happens? And I said, and here's the thing. It goes back to what I said. Just follow the law. Because one, either you might get hundreds of thousands of requests and you might grant them. And so what? What happens? And maybe nothing happens. Maybe nothing as to the health of the force changes. Maybe nothing operationally changes, in which case you followed the law. People have received their rights as are due to them under the Constitution and the laws of our land. And we all move on happy and healthy. I said, or maybe it does affect operations in some way. Maybe you do start seeing that it is causing an issue, in which case you would then be justified in denying some of these requests and you would have the legal grounds to do so. But right now, it's just this hypothetical fear of well, what if something happens? And that's not sufficient grounds under the law to deny these requests. So that's kind of how we laid it out. And, I hope that we can keep pushing that so that it's just broadly understood at the highest levels.
Yes.
I mean, when you have studies showing negative efficacy for flu shots, it raises the question, what are we doing?
Right. And if they had followed the law with COVID, we probably would not be getting even this many flu shot exemption requests, because now people are looking into this. I mean, and rightfully so.
Yes.
But if they had followed the law, people's eyes would not have been opened.
Yeah. It's
as they are now.
It's one of the blessings that has come from this. And I'll say this fight, this whole process, in a lot of ways, it has seemed like hell. It's been painful for a lot of people. People have suffered greatly, but there's been a lot of fruit. There's ultimately I come out of it with a blessing surplus. I say that all the time. I am blessed for having gone through this. So, it's what we make of it now, right? It's happened. We've suffered. A lot of eyes have been opened. And the real travesty is going to be if we don't do anything with that.
That's exactly right. Now, we talked, I asked you before, is the Board of Corrections ready to, or is sufficient to handle the task of dealing with all of this? And you said no. And I asked you the follow-up question. Do you think there should be a panel convened with the responsibility of administrative corrections on the divisions within each department of the military that caused the damage? And that's where you are pointing to that task force.
Yes. Yep.
So something that can be done right away is changing the personnel that is at the very top of the Pentagon.
Yep.
And making sure that this happens. So would you just explain what a setup of a task force might look like with all of the different arms to handle something like this? What is the personnel needed? What does that look like?
So it could be done in a couple different ways. You could have a single task force at the DoD level, or you can have sub-task forces under each service branch. But you would need a small cohort of people who understand like the manpower processes, the personnel processes, the legal lanes. And the truth is, what you really need are people who have suffered through this and done their own research, because ultimately, like, the COVID mandate was unlawful as implemented. I know that. I'm an attorney in the military, right? So, maybe people would presume like, oh, okay, it makes sense that you would know, but why should anyone else have known that? Well, there are a lot of junior enlisted who did their research and figured this out and looked at federal law and understood that this was so, like, using that as the template. I advocate for people who are affected by this to serve on those task forces, because it's not necessarily what was your career field in the military. It's helpful if you have specific backgrounds, but ultimately what we need are people who have lived and breathed this issue for the last 4 years, regardless of, what their career field labeled them in the military. Because, there are plenty of JAGs who, to this day, they have no clue what played out in litigation over this. They have no clue. In some ways, like, I always have to remind myself that we kind of exist in a bubble. We really do. And there's been some breaking out, by getting Trump to issue that executive order. There was a blip of kind of broad public acknowledgement that something went awry with the mandate. But for the most part, we are in a bubble. And, I'll say I know that there are JAGs still serving the military who went on about their business, not even knowing that this whole battle was raging, which is also why we see the continued incorrect processing of religious accommodation requests for the flu and things like that. So, my advocacy for these task forces would be find the people who have lived and breathed this for the last 4 years. They're the ones that are going to know every single way something went wrong and have contemplated all the ways to make it right.
Mhm. From a JAG perspective, what different approaches can those affected by the COVID mandates start taking or continue to take to start pushing towards accountability?
For the accountability piece specifically, it's going to be a little bit more challenging than I think the policy piece for like reinstatement and stuff like that. And I'll tell you why. It's because the people who were complicit in this, it's such a broad amount of people. And this is something that has been my perspective from very early on. And it's not always popular among all the COVID refusers because people are so desperate for accountability. But I've said there are categories of people who carried this out. There are people who did this knowingly. There are people who knew this violates the law. We need to figure out a workaround to make this mandate go forward anyway. There are people who didn't initially know, but who came to know and still stayed the course. And then there are people who, whether through, ignorance, dereliction, negligence, just never even understood that they were violating people's rights. And in the military, like if let's say you're a maintainer working on an aircraft, you probably don't mean to leave a wrench out on the flight line that gets, sucked into the jet and causes millions of dollars of damage. But if you're negligent, you're still responsible for that and held accountable. So there is, under military law, a mechanism to hold people who are negligent accountable for these kind of things. But I think it cuts a little too deep, and there has to be a decision made. There has to be accountability for this. Otherwise, there's nothing stopping this from happening again. And we just saw this happen in the anthrax era, right? It was the same issue of forcing people to take experimental drugs. Those ones were investigational new drugs, but you couldn't mandate those. And it was 5 years of litigation before that was resolved. And by then, people still haven't had their records corrected from that. And we're, 2 decades in. So, it's like as time goes on, people forget the lessons of history and we repeat them. So unless there is some significant measure of accountability, there's nothing preventing our senior-most leaders from just trampling service members' rights. So, it raises a question of how deep do we cut? At what level do people need to be held accountable? And, we have to balance operational readiness and experience with accountability. Like we can't, if every single officer or, senior enlisted that was complicit in this in some way was cut, we'd have another national security issue, which COVID itself, in my opinion, was a national security issue that we're still trying to recover from. But so, I don't know what that line looks like. I do know that, there's evidence of very specific people who knew that they were trying to skirt the law. And, when we have instances like that where we can point to specific evidence and say this person did this knowingly, I think that that's where we need to start.
Mm-hmm.
See where we can go from there. We're doing things. We're trying to work through Congress. We're trying to, get certain acts passed. Like I said, certain appropriations to remedy things. But on the accountability piece, it's going to have to come from the Department of Defense, from the SecDef, from the service secretaries. And I hope that they take that seriously.
So on the policy piece, what are you all doing with that? What do the acts say?
So there's a lot of different input right now, and there are different, this is what's so cool is we have, a small cohort of people that have worked together, and through this, we'll find like these other groups of people who have been working on something else, and, like a couple years in, we just finally make a connection, right? And realize that we've had parallel efforts and that kind of thing. But, anything from what I talked about, trying to get appropriations for funding to do, retroactive separation pay, trying to push for things like the ability to, if you would have had enough time in service to retire, being able to just submit for retirement rather than have to be reinstated and serve another 2 to 4 years. Simple things like that. Acts to prevent, like explicitly. And again, like I go back to just follow the law. A lot of people brainstorm, what can we do, this and that. And it's like 90% of these issues would not have happened if we just followed the laws and policies that were already in place. And so, it kind of gets frustrating working on some of this legislation stuff because it's like, if we don't even follow the laws that already exist, what difference does it make if we add new ones on top of it?
That's right.
So I don't know. I think other initiatives need to include education within the military. People need a deeper understanding of the Constitution. People need a deeper understanding of our rights. And you hear constantly, well, once you join the military, you give up your rights. Incorrect. Not true at all. So there's a huge lack of knowledge. And one other thing that I always advocate for is in the military, you do an after action report after every single thing you do. Whether it's prosecuting a court case, whether it's flying a specific mission, you always do a hot wash and figure out, okay, what went well, what went wrong? How do we, improve the things that went wrong? How do we repeat the things that went right? How do we train for those successes? We do that for everything in the military. And COVID is one spot where it's just kind of like slap a Band-Aid on it, try and put in a reinstatement policy and move on. And it's going to be painful, but we need to hot wash the COVID debacle. And like I said, there are JAGs sitting out there that this whole fight has just been swirling around and they have no clue that their own processes were called a sham by the courts. They have no clue that, they should be embarrassed and they just don't even know that the court said that. So, and most commanders as well. This information again, we're hypersensitive to it because we've been in this fight. We're very attuned to it. But, after Secretary Hegseth said this mandate was unlawful as implemented, I'm in some social media groups with active duty officers where many were saying, well, we still think that these people violated lawful orders. So there's just not an understanding of people need to understand what went wrong and why. And like, it needs to be, people need to be educated. Here's how these laws were violated.
Yes. And it's important to get going on that right away, because we're already 6 months into a 4-year term. That's like you've got 3.5 years left. I mean, you could really do constitutional training of the entire force right now. And even if that constitutional training was pulled by the next president, because I'm guessing that there would be authority to do that, then at least the entire force and military academies would have that training in. Those people would know, at least take it to their homes, of this is what the Constitution said. And oh my goodness, well, that's not what happened in the past 4 years, just to bring it into people's houses.
Right. And I mean, with pulling all the DEI training and things like that, should be plenty of open white space to fill it in with solid Constitution training, people understanding their oaths, people understanding, you aren't carrying water for an administration. You are supporting and defending the Constitution and principles. So
that's right. Yeah. One more question before I get to my final one. Okay. What is going on in the courts with all of these cases? I know that there are a lot of class actions. What's the current status?
So I actually just spoke a couple weeks ago with one of the attorneys that's helping litigate some of these. And it's pretty interesting because a lot of the court cases were mooted when the mandate was rescinded. So basically the court said, okay, there's no more mandate, so there's no more issue. All the cases went away. There was a case in the Fifth Circuit that was appealed. And in that particular case, some Coast Guardsmen said they actually had, I think, a vice admiral submit like an affidavit, a sworn statement saying, even though the mandate is gone, these individuals still are likely to suffer negative consequences to their careers because of the small community. And basically what he said was, if the courts determined that the mandate was unlawful, it would basically restore their reputations, right? Because once everything got mooted and, there's direction like pull all the negative paperwork from people's files, et cetera, you still have the majority of people, kind of like the officers I was just telling you about, that are like, yeah, but these people still broke the law, right? And this was something that I said in the meeting at the Pentagon. I said, one of the following two things is true. Either this was unlawful and the criminals are still serving in the military who perpetrated this, or it wasn't, and we stand credibly accused of being criminals who violated the UCMJ. Like one of those two things is true. And we know which one it is. We know it was unlawful. We know that the criminals are still serving in the military. But most people in surface don't have that perspective. They are, even in the face of the Secretary of Defense saying this was unlawfully implemented, they're still saying, these are the rule breakers. These refusers are the ones that couldn't follow orders. So anyway, in this litigation, this vice admiral basically said, a determination in court that this was unlawful would help their careers because their reputations would be restored. And the current and ongoing reputational harm could preclude them from getting promotions and things like that. So that is still in ongoing litigation. There's also another case ongoing that was Air Force, and it dealt a lot with the RFRA stuff, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and accommodation requests. And what's interesting is there's actually an attorney from the DOJ assigned to argue the case on behalf of Secretary Hegseth, basically. And it's the same attorneys that were arguing these cases under the Biden administration, and they're still fighting against giving any kind of relief to these service members. And, frankly, when I brought up some of these cases in the meeting at the Pentagon, again, there's just too much to keep track of every single thing. So I don't even think that they were aware that Pete Hegseth was a named defendant in these cases. But one of the attorneys on the case argued against the Doster case, which was the Air Force religious case that got a protective injunction for all the Air Force members. And, this attorney said in court, essentially, like, you don't have any rights unless and until you assert them in court, which is completely absurd. And, this is the same person that's continuing this litigation on behalf of the Department of Defense to this day, right?
This guy is in the Pentagon?
He's in the Department of Justice, but, he's litigating the case on behalf of the named defendants, which include Pete Hegseth. And so, it goes to your earlier question about like personnel changeover and that kind of thing, where it's like, yeah, you can have great appointees put in place at the highest echelons, but when you don't have, the next tier down, when you have them sitting and languishing, awaiting confirmation by Congress to actually fill their roles, that's a problem. When you have all the same, next tier bureaucrats that have been there for decades, all the same people that drafted and implemented the initial COVID policy, they're the same ones up there trying to now do a 180 and correct policy who, many don't have an incentive to do that. So, it's the same across the board, right? You have the top 1% switches over to Pentagon, and the bottom 99% are all the same people with all the same ideologies that, I'm sure you have some great people up there, neutral, just trying to carry out what they're directed to do. But I mean, you have a lot of resistance. You have a lot of apathy. And then, that transfers over to these court cases where you have DOJ holdovers as well that were making certain arguments on behalf of the Biden administration and Secretary Austin, and they're just keeping on their same path of litigation, but now in Pete Hegseth's name. So, I spoke with the attorney on some of these cases, and he said that they've tried to reach out and do a settlement and said, like, hey, the Secretary of Defense even said that this was unlawful as it was implemented. Like, let's reach a settlement. And they're like, we're not really interested in doing that. So, I don't think that, I'm speculating, but I don't think these attorneys are going back to Secretary Hegseth and his staff and saying, hey, which direction do you want us to go on this litigation now in light of, the new views on policy and things like that. So it's pretty interesting to see like all the ways that the administration can be undermined.
Yes.
Without even knowing it in some ways.
Yeah. Kacy, this is so fascinating and so sad. I mean, the system is it's beyond broken.
Yep.
It's like being chopped up into little pieces. And I don't know.
Yep.
Well, we just keep going.
I say, like, I hope that most attorneys would diligently represent their clients and that kind of thing. But I pointed out, like, on one of these cases, the DOJ attorneys, they interned for Kamala Harris. They interned for Gavin Newsom. And it's like, there's a certain persuasion that these attorneys have, which is probably why they were initially assigned to some of these cases under the Biden admin, right? Because they had a certain view on this. They wanted President Biden's mandates and the DOD's mandates to go forward. And, we've had a change of administration, but all those same attorneys are still running these cases. And without proactive input from their clients, which include Kirsty Noem and Secretary Hegseth and all the new appointees, without proactive input, I mean, they're just continuing down the same path of litigation, making the same arguments they made under the last admin. So,
I mean, the law shouldn't be political in any way, and yet we have seen it has been politicized and weaponized.
Yep.
So, well, Kacy, before I ask my last question, where can people find you?
I'm on X at Kacy J. Dixon, which is Dixon. My first name is Kacy. And that's really where I spend, most of my time advocating on this issue. So That's a good place to find me. Other than that, I'm usually trying to stay off grid in Wyoming, so you can try and find me there too.
Good for you. I wish I could move out there.
Yep.
And do some mountain hiking every day.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if the average American citizen can do one thing to combat the corruption that we have seen in our country today, what would it be?
Get educated. Get educated, understand what your rights are, and demand that they not be taken from you. So, I mean, this is something that it's been really interesting to see how this all has played out over the last few years. And again, it's one of those things where it's hell, but there's a blessing on the other side, which is that it has woke a lot of people up. And we have a society right now that has become very complacent. I would say get uncomfortable. It's time to get uncomfortable. And it's really easy in this environment to turn a blind eye. It's very easy to, most Americans have the basic necessities. We're a blessed country. Most Americans have a roof over their head and food on the table, their phones that they can turn and scroll through. So even if you're not thriving, you're fine in most instances. And so it causes a lot of complacency. And it's easier for people to just maintain that status quo than to do things like a lot of my fellow refusers have done, which is put it all on the line. You might lose your career over this. You might lose your income. You might have questions about how you're going to provide for your family. That's a very scary and uncomfortable place to be, but not nearly as scary and as uncomfortable as the possibility of losing your ability to even fight back down the road, right? Like having it all taken away. And now you've essentially abdicated your rights and your responsibilities. And now you don't even have the ability to fight back. So I would just tell people, we the people run this country, not elected figureheads, we do. We have rights that are inherent to us. They're not granted by some benevolent government. They're ours. So, it's like, that's not really a concrete thing. It's more conceptual, but like, that's what people need to understand is like, you have to get educated. You have to figure out what rights do I have? How are some of these rights being undermined and taken from me, and demand that they be given back? So that's what I would say is wake up, pay attention, start locally. But yeah, now's the time to get in the fight when it's, when you still have the ability to do it.
It sure is. I mean, I would say there's a bit of a lull right now, and this is a great time just to do what you're asking people to do, get educated, and teach your children, which is not always the easiest thing to do, about the Constitution and rights as well. And once you get started on it, it becomes easier.
Yep.
So thank you so much, Kacy, for joining me today. It was wonderful to meet you.
It was so nice to meet you too. I appreciate the opportunity. It was very nice to speak with you.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe to, and share our podcasts. I'll see you next week.